Hi, I'm Marion Schmidt. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in this department, and I'm on the organizing committee. And I'm very happy to introduce Rachel Germain as our next speaker. She did her undergraduate studies in ecology at the University of Guelph, and she actually had two theses. Her first thesis was on maternal effects in evolution in an invasive plant system, and her second thesis was on niche versus neutral dynamics in a tall grass prairie. She then went on to the University of Toronto to do her PhD with Ben Gilbert, and she will be defending this spring. And she just received a postdoc, so she's no longer looking for a job in the future. And she'll be, so congratulations. She'll be starting her postdoc at the University of British Columbia, and it's a biodiversity postdoc, so that's really great. She has published papers in the Journal of Ecology, Ecology Letters, and American Naturalist, and I'm happy to say that she just got her paper for the project that she is presenting today, accepted in the Proceedings of Royal Society Biology just 2 weeks ago. So congratulations, and join me in welcoming Rachel.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. It's amazing to be able to speak amongst people that I look up to so much. So today I'm going to talk to you. This talk's going to be kind of structured. First around talking about macroevolutionary relationships and one particular way in which they've been applied, and then where I think this field might be going with examples from my own empirical work. And so as Andy kind of finished off the panel discussion, there's this intricate relationship between the ecology and evolution of species. And so typically we think about evolution as something that's unfolding upon an ecological background, and the ecology of organisms affecting natural selection and patterns of diversification. And that as a result, this evolution can then in turn come around and affect the ecological relationships among species and extant communities, both on microevolutionary and macroevolutionary scales. And so as a community ecologist, I'm really interested in this kind of macroevolutionary component and how the macroevolution and macroevolutionary past of species affects their macroecological patterns. And so in particular, there's one way in which this has been applied in the past to this field of community phylogenetic assembly. And that whole field kind of started in 2002 with the inception of this paper that was based on the premise that closely related species tend to be more similar to each other. We can use phylogenetic patterns to infer whether or not competition is more important for structuring communities. For example, if communities tend to be more distantly related to each other than expected by chance, and we get this pattern of phylogenetic over-dispersion, that would indicate the competition is structuring a community. And can compare that to whether or not environmental filtering is actually most important driver of structuring communities. And so in this case, you get this non-random exclusion of species that are not able to persist in an environment. And you end up with this pattern of phylogenetic underdispersion, where communities are more closely related to each other than expected by chance. And so right around when I started my PhD, this is kind of the height of phylogenetic community assembly. There's tons and tons of papers on this stuff. And at this point, we kind of know that these phylogenetic patterns actually tend to be quite weak, or actually tend to be very inconsistent with WebAL's predictions, even when you know what the underlying ecological mechanisms are. And so there are a number of examples of this being the case, and also a number of examples of people trying to figure out why this is the case. And I want to focus on one in particular that kind of looks at how mean phylogenetic distance or phylogenetic underdispersion to overdispersion is shifting along this annual rainfall gradient, with the expectation that at low levels of rainfall, conditions are more stressful, and at high levels of rainfall, competition is more important. And so given the framework that I had just described, you kind of expect this positive relationship where communities are supposed to switch from being more phylogenetically under to more phylogenetically over-dispersed as you switch from environment being more important and competition being more important. And so here's the results of this actual paper. And there's kind of two things that I want to point out about this paper in particular. The first is the R-squared value here is pretty low. This relationship explains essentially 4% or this rainfall gradient explains 4% of variation in phylogenetic patterns. And the other thing that I want you to notice is that this actually only explains 4% of variation in the subset of local communities that actually happen to be significantly over or under dispersed. And so ignoring all of these intermediate ones that didn't show significant patterns. And so if you can actually look across the entire, include all of the data, things actually look like this. There's essentially just no pattern. It looks kind of like a random burst. And the reason why I picked this paper specifically is because it's often been cited as an example of when community phylogenetics actually works as you'd expect it to, whereas I kind of think that maybe that's not necessarily the case. And so this kind of leads to this overall question that has come up a lot recently of whether or not macroevolutionary relationships are even useful for understanding current ecological processes in extant communities. And so, what I kind of argue is that yes, they probably are, but we really need this revised framework that's really consistent with both ecological and evolutionary theory. And from the ecological end, we kind of know now that not all differences among species promote coexistence via competition. And so this whole idea that differences are good, differences allow species to coexist, is not necessarily the most accurate now that we know that there are actually two types of differences that have opposing effects on whether or not species can coexist with each other. And so the first thing we talk about is a stabilizing difference. And this is essentially, you can think of it as a niche partitioning kind of difference. And here I've illustrated that with these two species that have differences in root depths. And so they're accessing resources at different depths in the soil profile. And so the longer, or the more different those species are in those root depths, the more likely they'll be able to coexist. And this is something that promotes coexistence. We can also think about those effects that oppose coexistence, like a fitness difference. And so here again, we have these same two species, except in this case, they're actually accessing soil resources at the exact same location in the soil profile. One species is just better at accessing those resources. It's a better competitor for that same suite of resources. And so you'd expect that this would essentially prevent coexistence from occurring, and we'd end up with the exclusion of this weaker competitor. And so here I'm kind of illustrating this with a trait example, but we can actually quantify the strength of stabilizing and fitness differences using population growth models, which I'll get to. And so the reason why this is important is because coexistence ultimately depends on the relative strength of these stabilizing differences and these fitness differences. And so if we're looking at how the probability of coexistence essentially is shifting along as a function of phylogenetic distance, essentially if stabilizing differences are evolving at a faster rate than fitness differences, we kind of end up in this coexistence zone, which is good, where distant relatives are actually more likely to coexist with each other. But the opposite is true if fitness differences actually evolve faster. We end up kind of down in this exclusion zone where distant relatives are actually less likely to coexist because there's really large differences in their competitive abilities, and they would ultimately exclude the weaker competitor. And so we don't really know how these two types of differences actually evolve relative to one another, which itself is a really interesting question. But it's also kind of a problem for phylogenetic community assembly because the whole implicit assumption of that field is that essentially that stabilizing differences are evolving faster than fitness differences. And I also kind of want to extend that to the macroevolutionary realm, where it's really well understood that the evolution of competitive differences among different species depends on their biogeographic history, or whether or not those species have historically occurred in sympatry or allopatry. So that leaves me to my research questions. The first is whether or not phylogeny can actually predict the evolutionary trajectories of these stabilizing and fitness differences. And the second is whether or not these trajectories depend on whether or not species have evolved in sympatry or allopatry. And so my predictions for this, if species are occurring in sympatry and a stabilizing difference represents kind of a niche partitioning kind of scenario, that we expect through character displacement that a species co-occur in sympatry over evolutionary time. We should see that we should get this more rapid evolution of stabilizing differences amongst species that occur in sympatry compared to those that have evolved in allopatry. And for fitness differences, kind of similarly, we know that species from different parts of the world tend to be very different in competitivity when they enter new environments. And so this leads me to this prediction that, that allopatric species should evolve fitness differences at a faster rate than sympatric competitors. And so because of these relative evolutionary rates in sympatry and allopatry, this kind of leads us to this expectation that coexistence should be more likely between distant relatives that have evolved in sympatry, and also that coexistence should be less likely between distant relatives that evolved in allopatry. And so I tested this in a Mediterranean annual plant system. It's a really great system for a number of reasons. The first, if you're interested in testing the mechanisms that maintain diversity, this is a hyperdiverse system. There's tons and tons of species. A lot of these species happen to be annual species, which is really great if you're trying to estimate population growth rates. And the kind of third interesting thing about it is that we have replicated Mediterranean biomes across the world. And so if we're trying to compete things that have historically occurred in allopatry, you kind of want to pick species that occur in regions that have similar climates. And so I conducted this experiment on 30 species that are all here. 20 of them are native to California, and they all have overlapping geographic ranges in the Central Valley, whereas 10 of them were native to the southern portion of Spain. And again, I picked those two regions because their climates are actually very similar to each other. And unfortunately, I didn't get to go to any islands, but I did this in a greenhouse. And essentially, I conducted a bunch of competitive trials that allow me to first parameterize an annual plant model, and then use the different parameter estimates to calculate stabilizing differences, fitness differences, and then the outcome of coexistence. And these equations are, it's from Chesson, and it's used by Jonathan Levine and Peter Adler, and these are really well understood at this point. And so I just want to give you a kind of a general idea of how I grew species in order to estimate these things. Essentially, I grow species in pairwise competition, and we grow them at a range of relative frequencies where both species are really rare at one end of the frequency. This blue one's rare here, this red one's rare here, and also inversely very abundant. And then we can track their population growth rates and estimating the number of seeds produced, how viable those seeds are. And when both species are reciprocally very common in a community, we can estimate their intraspecific competition coefficients. And also when they're really rare in a community, we can estimate their interspecific competition coefficients. And so this is essentially all of these pairwise trials that I've done were conducted in a way that I could parameterize an annual plant model and calculate these things. And so I did this for 20 pairs of competing species. 10 of them were a sympatric pair of species, so 10 sympatric pairs of species that were both native to California, and 10 California-Spain pairs that historically occurred in allopatry. And so one additional kind of novel and strong point of this experiment is that we actually didn't do all pairwise combinations of species, which is something that a lot of people have done in the past. We actually selected competitive pairs that are phylogenetically independent from each other. And this is to kind of prevent any problems of phylogenetic pseudo-replication. And so what I mean by that is here I've just kind of outlined, these are two different competitive pairs. And the one thing you can note is that at no point along their phylogeny do those pairs overlap at all. So they're essentially phylogenetic independent contrast, but in a kind of an experimental way. And so I'm going to show you 3 kind of main results from this experiment, and then kind of talk about the implications of those results for kind of 3 specific fields in ecology and evolution. And so the first result that I'm going to show you is essentially how these stabilizing differences and fitness differences evolve. For stabilizing differences, we see this pretty amazing pattern. This is exactly what I would have expected, where species that have historically co-occurred in a similar region in California you see that it's only amongst extremely closely related species that there's very low ecological differences amongst them. And you see this pretty rapid evolution of stabilizing differences with almost nearly complete ecological separation by about 80 or 90 million years. And so we can contrast that to what's going on with allopatric species pairs. And it's pretty cool because there's just nothing. And this is, if I could draw what my ideal result would be, this would be it. So we see that high kind of stabilization, evolutionist stabilization for sympatrics, and nothing for allopatric species pairs. And so then if we look at fitness differences, again, I expected that allopatric species would have higher fitness differences than sympatric species pairs. And that's exactly what I found. There's a faster rate of evolution in those in fitness differences amongst allopatric species pairs compared to sympatric species pairs. And one thing that I didn't quite expect, you'll notice that this is on a log scale. That means that this is actually an accelerating function of phylogenetic distance rather than a saturating one, which is kind of interesting. And so what this means for coexistence, again, if coexistence is the outcome of the relative evolution of stabilizing differences and fitness differences, this means that for sympatric species, there's no relationship between the probability that species will be able to coexist with each other and phylogenetic distance. There's no reason to expect close relatives to compete more intensely than distant relatives for species that have occurred in the same region over evolutionary time. We can contrast that to those that evolved in different regions, and what you can actually see is the opposite of what we'd expect. Close relatives are actually more likely, they're kind of close to this boundary between coexistence and exclusion here, whereas distant relatives are far less likely to coexist with each other because they just have very large fitness differences. And so I also want to break this down a little bit further. This is exactly the same data for the fitness differences that I showed you earlier, except this time it's kind of broken down, separating by sympatric and allopatric. And one of the things about fitness differences is that it's actually the product of both differences in demography between two species, or how many seeds two species produce, or the differences in the number of seeds that two species produce, and how viable those seeds are, so this kind of demographic component, but also how different they are in their competitive abilities. And so what we can do is kind of deconstruct separately for sympatric and allopatric species to what effect these relationships are being driven by a demographic component and a competitive component. And so what we found is that for sympatric species, the demographic difference, or how different species are in their seed production and viability, is the only thing that's driving this positive relationship between phylogenetic distance and fitness differences. You'll see this as kind of a flat line, and it's only this one here, this demographic component, that's explaining that relationship. Whereas for allopatric species, although both of them are kind of increasing similarly to fitness, it's only this competitiveness component that's significantly increasing with phylogenetic distance. And so what this means to me is that these fitness differences evolve through distinct mechanisms in sympatry and allopatry. And so what this means for the field of phylogenetic community assembly, at least in this annual plant system, is that I essentially find no support for this assumption that closely related species should compete more intensely, and therefore phylogenetic overdispersion would indicate that competition is occurring. And I'm actually not the first person to kind of figure this out. There's a couple of recent papers where they did something very similar and came to a very similar conclusion. I kind of want to extend that to communities where there's potentially a lot of non-native species present, which is probably a number of different communities. And in this case, through competition alone, we would expect that distant relatives would be more likely to coexist with each other, distantly related non-native species, because they're or closely related non-native species with native communities, because the fitness differences in that case are very small. And so that would mean that this pattern that we would typically infer to as evidence of environmental filtering is actually competition-based because of exotic species potentially. And this is interesting because there's kind of this meta-analysis in 2009 that found that 60% of studies find evidence of phylogenetic underdispersion. And so whether or not that's environmentally driven or driven by invasive species is something that we don't know yet. The second implication has to do for species invasions. And so there's this big question of, what explains variation in the impacts of non-native species? And so what I mean by that is there's variation amongst non-native species in whether or not they can actually even enter an environment. We could try to introduce it, it could fail. It can only be maintained in this case as an ornamental if we really, work very hard to allow it to persist here, as opposed to some other non-native species that tend to naturalize versus others that become invasive and noxious and kind of take over environments. And so what explains variation in this? And so people have been looking at phylogenetic relationships as one possibility. And so, there's two papers that both kind of indicated that close relatives are more likely to naturalize. But there's this kind of interesting, and this is totally supported by my results, where those close relatives were actually very similar in fitness. So there wouldn't be a lot of exclusion occurring in that case. One of the interesting things is that there seems to be some discrepancy among what people would expect amongst distant relatives. In one study, they found that distant relatives are more likely to fail to invade altogether, whereas in another study, they found that distant relatives actually were more invasive and more likely to be noxious invaders. And I actually think that my results could potentially reconcile this in the sense that I showed you fitness differences between two species, but I didn't tell you which one was winning and which one was losing. And the point with that is that species from a particular region are not more or less likely to be the winner. Some of the time the Spanish species wins, and some of the time the California species wins. And so, these distant relatives that are unable to actually enter a community might just be these low fitness Spanish species. Whereas these species that are able to enter a community and take over and invade could just be these very high Spanish species. And so it's variation in both the strength of fitness differences and which species of which origin happens to be more competitive that might be driving and explaining variation among species. And so the last implication, which is to me one of the more interesting ones, is what this tells us about macroevolutionary divergence and coevolution. We kind of see this rapid evolution of nearly complete ecological separation, which to me is very consistent with coevolutionary character displacement. And this is really highlighted by that difference with allopatric species, where essentially those stabilizing differences, again, were not constrained at all, which is consistent with a lack of historical interactions and lack of potential to co-evolve. And so, and so this essentially tells us there's these signals that historical interactions over macroevolutionary time shape present-day competitive interactions. And so, I posed this question of whether or not macroevolutionary relationships are even useful for understanding ecological processes. I think, all of the talks we've seen today kind of tell us that there's so many processes in evolutionary biology that are very well known, and we understand how they work. And so I think the challenge for community ecologists going forward is finding ways to incorporate these things in a more explicit and possibly better way than they have been currently. And I know Luke had some ideas about how to do this, so that's exciting. So that's it. Thank you all for listening.
I was just wondering, so correct me if I'm wrong, are you assuming that when you classify a pair of species as sympatric, are you assuming they've been sympatric for the duration of the divergence time occurring in them?
Yeah, so the idea is, it's not necessarily that they need to be sympatric for the entirety of it, but at least, I think, for example, a secondary sympatry type scenario would still work in this case. As long as they've been together for sufficient evolutionary time for these types of things to take place. And I feel like the results really support that as being a possibility, because I can't really think of something else that would cause a similar pattern, especially when you're comparing what's happening with those sympatric species to the allopatric ones. Yeah, and so, in California, a lot of, and some work by Sharon Strauss shows that a lot of annual plants tend to speciate actually in very close proximity, which is kind of interesting too. So there's very high potential for them to be kind of interacting in and out like over time. Yep.
Yeah, I really cool result. I'm not sure I really understood the logic behind your prediction and your results for the evolution of fitness differences in allopatric versus sympatric populations. So
Right.
would you just give that one another shot?
So the reasoning behind that, I mean, I was thinking about, for example, red queen dynamics, and so it could be the idea that different regions that are separate are kind of having their own sort of means, for example, in what the mean compatibility is, because if a species is just a poor competitor in its own environment, it will just be excluded potentially, right? And so, but if you have species from two different regions that are kind of on their own, like Spanish ones, for example, are higher or lower or something, that could potentially, that was my original thinking, is that it could have something to do with just differences in compatibility amongst regions, and also influenced by invasion biology, just that we know that species from different regions tend to be more successful, for example, when they come over to North America, and so the question is why?
Because some of those reasons might have to do with things like pathogens or others, so it's not, may or may not be intricate differences. So if I'm understanding this right, it's the assumption with that explanation, I think, is that equalizing mechanisms are indeed an important component of coexistence in both locations. Otherwise, that argument wouldn't work.
Yeah, so the thing that would be really interesting, I mean, this is just a logistical thing that we couldn't do, but if we had, California, Spain, California, California, Spain, Spain, so you can kind of see both ends of it, because I'm sure the same thing's going on over there, right? And what's even more interesting is if we could potentially get species from different regions, not just the two, but kind of look at biogeographic variation, and when you put things together, it separates them, and if, yeah, other Mediterranean regions across the world kind of would show similar things or not. I think that would be interesting. Yes?
So at some point you say that the predictions of the phylogenetic tests that more phylogenetically related species will be less able to coexist. So we're not seeing and basically having a study, which I think most of the time has been attributed to the phylogenetic niche conservatism hypothesis not being justified.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, so.
But my question is, people have thought of, well, let's avoid the whole phylogenetic problem and look at traits and see if species with more similar traits tend to not coexist, vice versa. Also have the studies find it and have don't. So even for those studies, we don't really see predictions being confirmed all the time. So is it possible that it's more than just the idea that the phylogenetic niche conservatism hypothesis is wrong? More to it. It could just be that it's just not right, that coexistence is dependent upon species being different from each other.
Yeah, I have so many reasons that I've thought about why sometimes these things don't work out. I actually think this stabilizing and fitness framework that I've talked about equally applies to the functional ecology kind of stuff, because there are some traits that would promote a stabilizing difference and some that would promote a fitness difference. So I think that's still an issue there. The reason why people have used phylogenetic relationships is because sometimes there's no good way to actually, we don't know if we're measuring the correct traits. We don't know if we can measure the correct traits. We don't know if we have the proper dimensionality of that problem, if it's just combinations of traits. And so that's why people initially wanted to use phylogenetics, right? And so this is just one of the problems, is kind of misapplying that ecological theory about how similarity might be important. But as you mentioned, it's also a problem of phylogenetic conservatism. And I actually, because I ended on this thing about incorporating more evolutionary theory, and I think, the thing with phylogenetic signal and being like, oh, do the traits show phylogenetic signal? Yes, no, does that explain the lack of pattern that I find for phylogenetic relationships or not? I feel like that's also a really big problem, because a lot of evolutionary biologists don't think about things in terms of like, is that trait conserved or isn't it? They think about it in terms of like, oh, is this a Brownian motion model, or is this like an OU model, or like they actually incorporate something about how those traits are evolving in a process-based way, which is something that I think ecologists have kind of lagged behind in doing so far. So there's that problem, you know, there's a scaling issue problem, there's a whole bunch of issues about phylogenetic scaling if you're looking at smaller, intermediate, and large scales and what your inferences are for phylogenetics at those different scales that are weird too. So there's like a whole lot of reasons why these things may or may not work out in the way that we'd expect.
But then the question is, where does that leave us, right? So is it pointless to try and perform these tests, phylogenetic tests or these trait-based tests? Like you show the type of test that has nothing to do with any of that. It's like an experiment where you try to see if the outputs obey what we would expect in theory, and then your experiment was successful, but you're working on an annual that you can perform experiments with.
Yeah, I mean, one of the studies that I cited by Nirwani, I think that's in like protists or phytoplankton or something. But yeah, so the question is, you know, are phylogenetic patterns meaningful? And, you know, I think in some cases they can be. I think Brian Aneker's done some stuff where he's seen like, you know, phylogenetic signals that match up to glaciation history and stuff like that. So that's kind of an interesting component of it. But in terms, I think your overall question is, can you infer a process from pattern? And I'm not sure that you can. I think it's kind of doing experiments like this where we can see this macroevolutionary signal in how species are competing and how they're competing in different ways. So yeah, I mean, potentially as people start to maybe think about new ways to incorporate ecological and evolutionary theory, maybe something could come out of patterns, but I can't tell you if that is going to happen or not.
Just a follow-up on JP's question. So this pattern where you get these fitness differences in allopatry, and then you get the you know, coexistence if they're in sympatry, it sort of suggests that there's this, you know, I think for most of these things we probably don't think of them as speciating sympatrically, which would imply that there's this this magic window, as it were, where, you know, you can be apart for a bit of time, but you really got to get back home.
Yeah.
If you're going to be able to coexist, and
Yep.
I think that's.
So that actually reminds me of kind of something I've been thinking about doing. I was talking to Nash about this earlier, but I was thinking about, you know, looking at population divergence, or just, you know, within a species, how the populations are diverging and how that affects how species are interacting, because that's kind of like the earliest stage. Because the problem with this stuff is we're all looking at kind of the species level, or when things are biological species that can't hybridize, right? But it's kind of like what's happening in that very small window where, you know, it's kind of like that area where we're seeing things really rapidly increase. But I really don't know what would happen if we had really good resolution at those small scales, small temporal scales over evolutionary time. So yeah, that's kind of something I'd like to look into more. Yep.
Any more questions for Rachel? Okay, please join me in thanking Rachel.